I just wanted to know, hands up quickly after lunch to make sure you're all awake. Have you seen a pig before? Great. Keep your hand up if when you saw that pig it looked a little bit like this at you. Very curious and inquisitive. Yeah? Great. So that's one of the ways that people commonly describe pigs, as being curious or inquisitive. This is important for us to remember because pigs have a complex social structure. They're very intelligent and they have lots of behavioural needs that come with that. So when we think about their welfare, that's an important thing to consider. And that's where our ethical obligations for caring for animals come from. They can experience pain, they can experience good emotions as well. So we need to keep this in mind. But today that's not what I'm going to be focusing on. I'm going to be talking a little bit about why animal welfare matters and how we can connect that to smallholder farming systems. A little bit about wastage and welfare, the concept of continuous improvement and tools that we can use to help us with this, and their potential value chain opportunities. So to start with, where is animal welfare related, or how is it related to smallholder production systems? Now I thought I was going to have to spend quite a bit of time talking about this in the session, but it's been really amazing over the last 2 days because we've heard a lot about animal welfare already. Colin spoke about it in his talk yesterday, in his opening speech, when he was talking about things like social stressors. A couple of our colleagues from Timor-Leste were talking about how their animals are happier when they're provided with the resources that they need. And some of our colleagues from the Philippines were also using animal welfare indicators in their project already. And then again as well, Florence spoke about it today. So there's a huge amount of relevance already, but just to add a little bit of extra context to that. When we think about animal welfare, this is the definition that the OIE uses. They talk about animal welfare as being healthy because that's a key component to welfare, and that's normally how we think about it. We describe it as animal health and welfare. But it goes a little bit beyond that. We also need to make sure they're well nourished, so that's touching on the feed that we have available to them. If they're safe and able to express behaviours that they're highly motivated to perform. So like that pig from the previous picture, opportunities to explore and be curious. And making sure that it's not suffering as well. So this is that comprehensive definition of animal welfare coming from the OIE. And then when we think about animal welfare in this definition, it starts to become a bit of an umbrella term because underneath that is captured all the different ways that we manage animals in the production system and across the value chain. Health, feeding, behaviour and housing are the 4 key components of the quality network, the welfare quality network. And that's one of the guidelines. It's very about animal welfare. And it's very similar to things like the 5 freedoms. But it's a bit of a more modern take on it. And we can talk about the 5 freedoms later in the pros and cons of doing different, using different frameworks if we want to. Animal welfare is also an integral part of a sustainable production system. It's been mapped to have associations with the environment, economics, food safety and worker safety. And this has been done in academic publications, like for example, this paper by Donald Broom, but it's also been used by industry too. So for example, the Coalition for Sustainable Eggs, that's based in Canada, uses this framework to speak about animal welfare. It's a component of a sustainable production system. And then finally, it's also something that we've been starting to map against the SDGs. So in the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, that's a multidisciplinary, multi-institution organisation that's coming together to talk about how livestock contributes to the SDGs. There's an animal welfare working group for that, and as a part of this, we've been starting to map examples or case studies and how they tie to the SDGs. With some of my colleagues at ILRI, we've connected them to 8 SDGs currently, and there's more still that we can explore. So all in all, really when we're thinking about how animal welfare connects to a value chain, regardless of the size of that chain, the impact that it has, and also the scale of production system, and all the way down to the farmer level, animal welfare has that, is an essential part of that production system. So let's move on to starting to talk a little bit how we can reduce waste and improve animal welfare at the same time. This is when we start to think about improving or raising the bottom line for animal welfare, making single minor steps to improve animal welfare. And when we do this, it comes hand in hand with production gains. So to give a little bit of context, this is a report that was published by the FAO in 2011, so it is a little bit a little bit older now, almost 10 years. And it looked at wastage of food losses from the meat industry, and classifying it according to different regions. We can see that all across the production system, we have losses that come in meat production, from the consumption end and down to the animal production end. And when we look across all of these different locations, that varies, but we can see that on-farm production losses are a substantial contribution, regardless of where we are. We can also see that slaughter and processing are also substantially contribute to this. And these are situations where animal welfare can have a key input to help reduce that wastage. I'm going to talk about two specific examples. The first one is from a research project that's been industry funded in Australia. It's a project that I led with the collaborators from different institutions. And one of the important things for this is it was actually an industry-funded project. So the Australian industry is spending a lot of time and money investing in animal welfare projects. This project was designed to look at the provision of enrichment, so something that is a valuable resource to animals, as an important point of production system. So we were giving lucerne hay, which is something that's very nutritious, and it's also something that they can use and manipulate, and pigs really like to play with and make use of when sows were farrowing. Our hypothesis was that providing lucerne hay would reduce parturition time and also reduce the number of stillbirth piglets that we were seeing. And when we provided this to sows at the time, they used it as both something to eat, but as a nesting material too. Sows, when they're farrowing, have a very strong drive to perform their natural maternal behaviours. So building a nest and getting ready to lie down and be still to have their piglets. This helps make them calm during the farrowing process, and it shortens that farrowing duration. That's important when we're thinking about wastage, because the shorter that farrowing duration, the less risk there is for stillbirth piglets. The longer it takes, and the more piglets that the sow has, the greater the risk of stillbirths. When we provided lucerne to sows, we had a reduction in the stillbirths. So compared to the control group, that over halved in the number of stillbirth piglets per sow that we were seeing. And this was in an experimental trial, and it's also been replicated in commercial settings too. So this represents a reduction in, I've got half an hour. That's okay. Thanks. I was like, there's no way possible I've been talking about. Okay, so back on track. So we can see this dramatic reduction in stillbirth piglets. The really important thing from this is that when we actually crunch the numbers, per 100 sows, it was costing us $350 to provide that lucerne enrichment. If you're trying to encourage a farmer to increase that, to spend that much money, that becomes a bit of a sticking point. But when we compare that to the amount of money they were gaining by having more pigs born alive, it paid for that and then in excess of that. So there was a benefit from both a wastage perspective, because the sow was having more live-born piglets, reducing wastage that way. It also means that the nutritional inputs that you're putting into that sow to maintain her through pregnancy are also being saved. The welfare of the sow is improving and the welfare of her piglets are improving. So this is what we like to call a win-win scenario. And it was a great outcome. This is another example from further along the production chain. So during transport and at slaughter, there are lots of risk factors for animal welfare that increase the likelihood of carcass damage. This is a study that's come out of the University of Choggas, or the research institution Choggas, and the University of College Dublin in Ireland. And we can see that there were different scores of stress and bruising to the carcasses. So let me talk you through this a little bit. This carcass here on the left had no bruising. When the animal was scored in lairage, there was no bruising evident on that animal either. So that had no welfare compromise before slaughter, and that carcass is now in really good condition to go to market. That second animal, you can see it here in that little light brown patch there, was scored as having bruising before slaughter, and then we look at the carcass after it's been processed. So all the hair has been taken off it, and this is the carcass that's going to market. We can see a small amount of damage. And then we come across to the carcass here on the right, where that again was scored as having the presence of bruising prior to slaughter. So sometime during the transport or during that handling phase, it's undergone some physical trauma. And we can see after processing, that carcass is going to have to be trimmed very dramatically to go into the marketplace. No one's going to buy that. And so that represents, again, this loss that we can see that would be saved if we had better animal handling and practices around transport. So again, one of those win-win scenarios. Animal welfare benefits and wastage is reduced. And these sorts of carcass offcuts, they cost obviously that butcher quite a lot of money. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, again, in terms of bottom line. And then just to touch on a project that's been happening here in Vietnam, as well as across other parts of East and Southeast Asia. It's actually run out of the University of Queensland, and it's funded by the OIE. And it's been training stakeholders, particularly abattoir and transport workers, on improved animal welfare. One of our colleagues here that collaborates in the ILRI Safe Pork project, Dr. Dong, is involved in this. He's not here today, but I'd recommend you really talking to him if you're interested in understanding how this project works. Okay, so let's move on a little bit to the pathway of continuous improvement. So what I'm specifically thinking about is how we can actually use welfare assessment as a tool to evaluate where the opportunities are for improvements in the production system, but also where, how the changes that we're suggesting to farmers are actually having an impact. So welfare assessment is a way that we can measure the animal's state of welfare at that current time point. It also gives us information about what's happened in the past and the risk to that animal's welfare in the future. So as an example, body condition score gives us an insight into the nutritional status of that animal up to the point in time, but it also acts as a predictive risk factor for future challenge. Sows that are in high body condition score or very low body condition score are more likely to have complications during farrowing, for example. We can use it as a tool to benchmark and take a baseline, also create targeted interventions, and as a monitoring tool over time. And that's that example that came out of the project from the Philippines yesterday, where they were looking at body condition score at the start of their project, as well as things like injuries and skin conditions. Okay, so just as an example, this is a picture of a sow from Uganda, I think. I took that off the ILRI website. And this is a body condition scoring chart. So if you think this sow has a body condition score of 1, put your hand up. No one? Any 2s in the room? Do you think she has maybe a body condition score of 2? I know it's hard to judge. Yeah, we've got a couple of people. What about body condition score 3? Yeah? Maybe anyone higher than that? Okay, so this is just a nice, we saw a range of responses in the room between 2 and 3, and this is just a nice example of when we're going to use animal welfare tools in our projects, just the same as what we use with a laboratory tool or any other kind of technique. We need to make sure it's standardised. So that includes making sure you're doing some interreliabilities between your staff and also within yourself over time, because that will change too. When we're assessing animal welfare, we need to pick tools or indicators that are practical, reliable and feasible. Examples of this that can work across the entire production chain for pigs are the number of pigs that need further care. And that can be at the farm level and across to at the abattoir. Body condition scoring, lameness and injury scoring, particularly when we break it down into certain areas of the animal, can be really useful tools too. So if you're thinking about starting to incorporate animal welfare indicators, there are 3 or 4 that I'd start with. And again, if you want to look for more information on this, you can have a look at the Welfare Quality Program, or even better still, I actually think that the Assure Well program is a really useful basic tool that you can use and modify again to your certain circumstances. All right, so let's just wrap up talking about some value chain opportunities. So when we're thinking about value chain opportunities, there's 2 different directions they can work in. They can work in a positive, encouraging direction, where you're talking about increasing opportunities to have higher value chain connections. We can also think about it in terms of being sure, from a negative perspective, or a sort of a pushing perspective, where we need to meet obligations of the value chain in order to be able to sell and connect to it. So this is kind of like that carrot and stick approach that you have, where there's a little bit of incentive and there's also potentially a little bit of pressure coming behind you. These are some examples of the kind of carrot value chains. This one comes from the UK, where they are, it's common now in supermarkets. I don't know specifically what percentage, but almost at least 10% of pork products are presented as high welfare products. We can see here that they talk about the product being organic. They also talk about it having high welfare standards. But when we think about these high-end value chains, they're not just restricted to Europe and the UK and countries like Australia as well. This is an example of a new value chain that's being established in Africa, in Southern Africa. And this is a really interesting program that was started by the group Conservation International. They started this as a program to connect smallholder farmers with the value chain to improve their, the land use, basically. So Conservation International was coming from a perspective of land use and conservation. But it's also then creating high value opportunities for farmers too. This is an example from beef, but the examples also exist from pork. And one here is right here in Vietnam, where we have Bac Tom, who is a partner of the ILRI Safe Pork Program. And this is a photo of some high quality organic pork, or high quality pork, that you can buy online on their online store. When you go and have a look at the description of that, they describe it as the opportunities that the animals have in terms of animal welfare. Specifically, the pigs get to listen to music and sunbathe every day, and that was one of the pieces, that's a direct quote coming from that website. So again, we can see that there are opportunities for high-end value chains in different parts of the world. The other thing that's starting to happen is there's a growing amount of research around the consumer's perspectives on animal welfare. For example, a paper that was published from China in 2014 said that over 65% of consumers agreed that they should have animal welfare laws. And more than half of the survey, people in the survey were willing to pay for high-value welfare products. And that's a specific question around animal welfare. These questions about willingness to pay for animal welfare specifically are not that common, but we can also see there's a willingness to pay for things like organic products. As an example, coming out of Vietnam, a willingness to pay for organic foods was present, with men describing the benefits of them seeing, of the reasons why they would buy organic as saying that it's healthy and safe, and women saying that they would find it nutritionally valuable. And so these are consumer perceptions, and basically it represents the opportunities to target more high-end value chains. Other examples come out of Thailand too. So again, there was over half of the respondents in this random survey were willing to pay for organic pork. And one of the reasons why they were willing to pay for organic pork, they stated, was ethical concerns around animal welfare. So, make no mistake, when I'm talking about these value opportunities, or these value chain opportunities, they are still niche, but all this evidence demonstrates that they are growing, and there are opportunities there. And particularly connecting smallholder farmers, where they have more of a personal relationship with their animals, and more one-on-one care, there's a clear pathway for high value chains and opportunities that way. And then finally, just to wrap up, there's also the stick approach. So, and just to touch on this, there's been a lot of change recently in policies, or a lot of momentum, I should say, from a government level around policies on animal welfare. And this is a really good thing. And it's not being used as a negative at all, but I think it just represents the changing perspectives that are happening at a government level as well as at a consumer level from those past examples. For example, the African Union has now adopted a 5-year action plan for animal welfare. And this happened maybe 12 or 18 months ago. And this is a strategy, but it also accompanies specific action plans, which is a real positive. Also, some colleagues earlier this week were telling me that Vietnam has done the same. Last year, they passed an animal welfare law that actually covers the welfare of farm animals and animals in scientific research. That's going to be implemented in 2020. And this, again, represents, I think, a lot of opportunities that governments see to connect, to have improved animal welfare and the benefits that can come from that, particularly from a trade perspective. So that's another reason or rationale why we should be thinking about animal welfare in our projects. And I'm just going to wrap it up and say that animal welfare is really a pillar to sustainable production, as I've demonstrated. These are sort of these summary take-home points. It's also a tool that we can use to reduce wastage and measure change over time. And it's a feature that we can use to connect to and maintain value chains. So if anyone has any questions about how they can incorporate animal welfare into their projects, or if you're just interested in hearing some examples, I'm always happy to talk about it. It's my favourite thing to talk about. So I'd really recommend getting in touch. Thank you.
much, Rebecca. It was a very interesting presentation, and you kept everyone actively listening, so that's fantastic. So, to the floor, questions, please. We have 7 minutes. So
Thank you. That was brilliant. I thoroughly enjoyed that. You mentioned body score as in relation to welfare issues, particularly injuries. I was wondering, do you sort of think we should also include an assessment of the leg, like have a score for legs as well? Because you mentioned lameness, but you didn't sort of connect that, and I was just wondering whether you strongly.
Yeah, I'll pop back to that slide. So, yes, basically there's been a lot of research around animal welfare indicators, and these are 4 that keep on coming up consistently, and they're related to each other. If an animal is lame, particularly when it's quite significant lameness, that's obviously going to affect her ability to get around and eat. So we see that association, but they also act independently of each other. One of the other benefits of so yes, I totally agree, Colin, being able to lameness score is a really important thing. Leg conformation as well, yeah, if you want to look for breeding traits too. So there's so many different indicators out there that we could use. I think this is a really nice starting point, these 4 here. And again, injury scoring as well can be helpful to help understand what that cause of lameness is, particularly if you're looking at breaking it down into those positions.
The next question.
Thank you, that was a really great talk. I'm just wondering, and again, back to Matthew's talk on nudges, have you got any examples or suggestions that we have for, particularly when we're working with slaughtermen? So they may, sometimes it's the butcher himself, so they may be able to sort of take on board the understanding of sort of economic losses and consequences, but sometimes they're sort of essentially calculate, and we have a huge problem with welfare in our in Western Kenya. Any thoughts on nudges towards welfare?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've done a little bit of work in Indonesia before with at abattoirs, and again that was the same issue there. There was a high turnover rate of staff, so that's one of the challenges, because even if you have an abattoir that has excellent training and a policy and practices around animal welfare, those staff aren't there consistently to be aware and get exposure to that. One thing that kind of we can retrofit to that is if you are having better strategies to handle your animals, if your workplace is safer, if you have just makes your workplace more appealing, and that actually increases staff retention rates. So there might be opportunities to provide training and education around safety and worker benefits that are kind of come from that, and then that will lead to animal welfare benefits, and that can help retain workers in the abattoir system. And that's just speaking from data that's come out of other research projects in that space. So I don't know how that would work in a country like Kenya or a country like Indonesia, but it is something that's worthwhile to investigate. And that's also an important point if we're thinking about interventions that are just around food hygiene and practices. This sort of creating that incentive to the slaughtermen can be a really important point. In terms of nudge theory and how you could potentially use that, I think it would be something that would be a valuable reinforcement tool, but you need to actually share that information in the first place. And again, there's been studies in pig farms in Australia, for example, where you use something that's like a cognitive behavioural intervention, where you actually talk to people about their attitudes behind their practices, and then suggest alternative ways that might help shift their attitudes. And if you can, and so again, using nudge techniques to reinforce that has been effective in those scenarios. So there's a couple of examples, but there's a lot that comes from the literature and projects that my research team has done as well.
So thank you very much. I don't think so we can take any more questions, but Rebecca would love to have those questions to be discussed over email or when she's around during the breaks. So thank you very much.
Just one. Rebecca, as you just